Well, welcome again to another episode of Christian Answers. And this is a program dedicated to answering questions that come up for Christians and the church and Christianity. Answers that need to be answered, questions that are asked of us in our culture today. We live in a very secularized culture. It is in no way a Christian culture. If it ever was one. Our country here in the United States is over 200 years old. Some people refer to it as a Christian nation, but I can assure you right now, this nation is not a Christian nation by any stretch of the imagination. At one time, many decades ago, had a Christian consensus, or it had somewhat of a vague Christian worldview, and there were a lot of people who adhered to that basic Christian worldview, even though they were not personally committed, oftentimes to the church or the Bible or to Jesus Christ even. They did hold to a basic Christian consensus, but now that Christian consensus, as far as a majority opinion, is no longer here. We are living in a secularized country with secular laws, and oftentimes it is hostile to the Christian faith. And so we have to answer questions about the faith and no longer can just simply assume that people understand Christianity or the reason why things are as they are in the Christian faith, or why we hold the values we hold, or why we live the lives that we live. We have to have these explained now very carefully because our culture is vastly ignorant of even basic Christian teachings. Well, one of the things in the last couple of years, even 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that have come down and began to attack values, Christian values that we thought would never be under attack, we are seeing under attack today. And one of the areas is marriage. The very definition of marriage now is being trashed. Now, the Christian definition of marriage is a union of a man and a woman. If you go back to Genesis, we've talked about this before in the Old Testament. Genesis is the pattern, is the established foundation for marriage, where you see Adam, who is a man, and Eve, who is a female. God brings them together, joins them together as man and wife, and that is the foundation of a true marriage. And that has been the way it has been all the time. The Jewish people taught that right from the scriptures. And then on into the Christian era, even with Jesus Christ, reaffirmed that same passage in the New Testament. He goes back and quotes that same passage and says, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That a man will leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife. Female, a man, male, will leave his parents, male and female parents, and will join together with his wife, female, and they will become one flesh. That is the pattern for a true, real marriage. Now, what we see today is a counterfeit, is a bogus, fake social construct. It's called gay marriage. There is no single way that you can define marriage as two men and two women. And yet, today, we have a movement underfoot that is undermining and almost completely destroying the traditional biblical definition of marriage. And so we have to answer the charges against marriage that are being lofted and attacked by the secularists. We have to answer and say, why is it that a marriage can be only man and a woman? Well, I've spent a couple episodes talking about the Old Testament foundation for marriage as a man and a woman. Now I want to talk about the New Testament foundation for man and woman as a marriage, not anything else. And so we turn to the book of Romans, and we go to the book of Romans in the New Testament, the first chapter, and Paul the apostle talks about what has happened in his day, the first century. This is not new. You're thinking that all of this stuff about gay relationships and homosexuality, this is a new development. Well, it was known about this stuff was going on in the first century. It was going on in the Greek world. It was going on in the Roman world. And Paul lists it as one of the grave sins. He talks about it, and he talks about it in verse 26 in chapter 1 of Romans. Let me read that section and then talk about it. It says, because of this, in verse 26, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relationships with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversions. And so, obviously, this verse is talking about lesbianism, and it's talking about homosexual male relationships. And Jesus Christ reaffirmed traditional marriage in his teaching, and now Paul the Apostle is pointing out the deviant, sinful, aberrant relationships that were going on in the first century, and he talks about them as sins and as shameful lusts, indecent acts. I mean, he just uses every single word that he could think of to point in a negative direction and discourage this kind of activity. And so from the New Testament, there is not one shred of evidence that we are permitted to soften the biblical definition of marriage. Now, there are people within Christianity. There is a new book out by a Harvard College student who says he took off a whole year to study the Bible on the subject, and he came to the conclusion that the Bible is totally compatible with gay marriage, and gay marriage is totally compatible with the Bible. And so he's running around the country now trying to convince Christians that they need to embrace gay marriage and be accepting and open to this kind of wedding ceremony in the church. And this is simply foolishness. This is simply incompatible with the Bible. I think a lot of the other gay activists laugh at this guy and say, look, if you can make a square circle round and you can make a round circle square, like what you're trying to do with making gay marriage compatible with the Bible, so be it. Good for you. But we're not going to worry about trying to do that. And they're right. You can't make a square circle, and you can't make a circle square. And you can't make the Bible give legitimacy to gay marriage because it is so firmly against any kind of homosexual activity. And so to try to do so is foolishness. And so we need to go through the Bible. We need to show how you cannot make something that's wrong and is wrong from the Old Testament all the way to the New Testament. You can't make it all of a sudden right because you come up with some new and different and creative way to interpret the Bible. No, you are twisting and distorting and really misrepresenting the Bible. The Bible clearly teaches that all homosexual activity, whether you want to call it outside of marriage or inside of marriage, is wrong. That's it. And so let me go through this passage in Romans in our second part of the Christian Answers and explain why Romans is actually teaching what it seems to be teaching and prohibits gay sex. And so you can't call that marriage even if you make a law saying it is so. So don't go away. We're going to be back for part 2 of Christian Answers in just a second. God bless. Welcome again. We're here at part 2 of Christian Answers, and we are going through the first chapter of Romans. And I just read a passage about that depicts the sinful practice of lesbianism and also gay male sex, homosexuality. And we're going to go through here, and we're going to try to answer some of the supposed reinterpretations of this verse to make it very compatible, supposedly, with the new gay movement that's underfoot in our country. Now, some of the people who are trying to convert Christianity and trying to convert Christians and the church over to accepting what has always been a sin. They want to say that the kind of activities outlined here in the book of Romans in the first chapter, those are things that are talking about something different than what the gay activists are talking about today. The gay activists today who are talking about and pushing for so-called same-sex marriage or so-called gay marriage, they are talking about a committed, monogamous, same-sex relationship, and they are not talking about what the Bible is talking about. But here's the problem with that line of thinking. First of all, it is a falsehood to say that homosexuals today, whether lesbian couples or gay males, are monogamous by and large. There is a small percentage in the single digits of homosexuals, lesbians, or male who are committed to monogamy. The vast majority, 90-some% of all homosexual activity is totally separated from any kind of idea of monogamy. So it is not true to try to promote this idea of a homosexual or gay marriage and say that homosexuals want a loving, lifelong relationship, partnership, monogamous, committed relationship of love and acceptance and all that. That is a small minority of the people, because the vast majority in that community do not want that and do not pursue that. And so that's a straw man when they try to bring that in. The second thing we need to see from this verse here is that some of the gay activists in the church are wanting to say, well, this is talking about some kind of pagan religious or temple prostitute activity where older men had sex with younger men, younger boys, and this was common in the Greco-Roman world, and this is what Paul is talking about here. He's not talking about regular adult consensual homosexual activity. He's actually talking about an older adult male relating to a younger boy in some kind of a prostitution situation. But that's not true, because it's not just talking about a man talking about having a relationship with a younger boy. It's talking about women. It says very clearly, even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. The women were doing this too. And this was not a common practice in the so-called pagan religious temple cults, where they had male prostitute boys, and these older men would have sex with them, or that there were these male boys who were slaves in household in the Greco-Roman world, and the males had sex with the boys. This is not what it's talking about, because it mentions that the women exchanged natural relations with the unnatural ones. That was not a common practice among the women. There were not these women lesbian relationships in the kind of relationships that the gay activists are trying to have us believe that took place in this Romans passage. No, this is talking about homosexuality and lesbianism, plain and simple. It's not talking about anything complicated. Paul is not going into all the different ways that homosexuality expressed itself in the first century. He's simply talking about the act of gay sex, whether it's lesbian sexual relationships or male homosexual relationships. He's not getting into all the different forms. He's just saying all of it is wrong. He's not trying to be an expert on the field of sexuality among same-sex relationships. He's simply saying, just like the Old Testament said, it's wrong. Any kind, any form, at any time, same-sex sexual relations are wrong. And everyone from the very first century Christians all the way up until just very recently has always understood it that way. And there's nothing in the text, there's nothing in the context, there's nothing in the Greek language, there's nothing that would move us away from the traditional understanding of this verse, because the passage reads that way. And so, in other words, to try to come in and say, well, they're not really talking about what's going on today in our modern world, the monogamous same-sex couples and all that stuff. That is to bring in something totally foreign to Paul's discussion of this in the text. That is to bring in our own spin or our own twist to the scripture and to try to use it for propaganda purposes. And that's what the real heart of the issue is right now. The gay activists are trying to get into the churches. They're trying to soften up the convictions of Christians, and this is simply used for propaganda purposes. That's all. The mainstream gay activists really don't take these Christians who are trying to argue with the Bible to justify same-sex marriage. They don't really take their arguments very seriously, but they say, good, go at it, because we need all the propaganda we can to get our victory in this movement. And so they're putting up with the so-called gay Christian movement, the people that want to try to come up with the Bible and try to somehow justify what they're wanting to do. The gay activist leaders are saying, great, go at it, and if you can convince some gullible Christians that the Bible actually affirms gay marriage, great. If you can change denominational policy, great. Whatever it takes to win our victory, that's what they're doing. But these Christians, these naive, gullible Christians, especially the Christian leaders, they're being used as pawns in the gay activist agenda. They're coming into churches, they're infiltrating the pulpits, they're coming into denominations, they're holding workshops in churches and seminars, and they're trying to convince the Christian world, hey, the Bible actually does support gay marriage. Why don't we jump on board and get with it? And they're doing it out of propaganda purposes. And so we need to read that, and we need to see that, and we need to look at it for what it is. When we read passages in the New Testament like Romans 1, and we look at what the words say, and it says that, let me read it again, because of this God gave them over to shameful lusts. That's a bad thing. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. That's lesbianism. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. That's gay homosexual activity. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversions. And that is simply an explanation of what gay sexuality is all about. There's nothing more, nothing less to say. But let's go to part 3 in just a second. I have a little bit more to say about this passage, so stick with me. Well, welcome to part 3 of our program, Christian Answers, and we're looking at the section in the book of Romans. The Apostle Paul is explaining the sinfulness of homosexual activity, and we're covering and trying to answer some of the charges and some of the claims of the so-called gay Christian movement, saying that Romans actually does not say anything about what we know of homosexuality today. That's a tall claim, and we don't believe it for a second, but let's try to answer why they're wrong in making that claim. Now, one of the arguments that the gay Christian movement is trying to make and convince Christians of is that when it talks about unnatural relationships, it says here that their women exchanged natural relationships for unnatural relationships. And it says, in the same way, men also abandoned the natural relationship with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. So they're trying to say, when it talks about unnatural relationships, that these people, the men and the women, the two women are having an unnatural relationship and the two men are having unnatural relationships. It's really not talking about homosexuality being unnatural. It's talking about something akin to like a real straight person actually engaging in homosexuality and against their natural desires, or a a woman who is not a lesbian actually engaging in lesbianism even when she's not attracted to a member of the same sex. So in that sense, this is all confused and all twisted, because it's actually taking a straight person and having that person have sex with a same-sex person, and that indeed would be unnatural. Now that's their argument. That's one of the strongest arguments they have. They're saying this is actually talking about heterosexual people engaging in homosexual activity. Well, it doesn't say anything about that, and it doesn't even hint that that's what's taking place. That is a real stretch of the imagination to try to imagine in your head a person who is actually heterosexual and yet they're engaging in homosexuality, or a woman who is actually attracted to men and yet she engages in lesbianism. That is nowhere near this text. This text is doing exactly what it says it's doing. It's describing lesbianism, and it's describing homosexual male activity. So to try to make this into something that it's not is a total lie and distortion, and that's what's happening. People are coming into the Christian church, they're looking at a passage, they're looking at a square, and they're saying, through enough creativity and interpretive twisting of the scripture, I can make that square into a circle. And they're looking at circles, and they can say, well, give me enough time and I'll show people that that circle, it's actually a square. And that's what they're doing here. They're trying to justify, rationalize in any way they can to try to get the Christian church on board with the homosexual agenda, the gay agenda in our society today. Now, we have to admit that the activists who are pushing for this have made a lot of progress just in the last couple years. We have a president that has endorsed their cause. We have politicians who are jumping on that bandwagon because they think that's the new thing. We have courts in our country, the court system, that is beginning to rule in the favor of the gay activists, state after state after state. And it's so, and the media, of course, the news networks and the programming and the mass media, they have already jumped on board, and they're promoting it as vigorously as they can. Okay, so now the last holdout is the Christian church. The last bastion of moral sanity in our country is Christianity, and now the activists are sending their messengers and their surrogates into Christianity to try to convince Christians, well, your Bible doesn't really teach that this is a sin, so why don't you get on board with what we're doing? That cannot ever be, because the Bible is very clear. If we look at the passage, let me read it again. Paul is outlining different forms of corruption, and he says, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. That refutes the whole argument of the activists saying, well, this is actually heterosexual men participating in unnatural homosexual relationships. No, they had lusts in their heart for the same sex. That's homosexuality. And the lesbian relationships, the women had lusts in their heart for other women. That's lesbianism. If this were the case, that these were heterosexual people engaging in homosexual activity, they wouldn't have had lust in their heart. They would have had some other thing, but it wouldn't have been same-sex lust in their heart. It says, even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural. The natural in this verse, in this context, is talking about the natural created order that God established men, and He established women in the beginning in Genesis. That's the natural way. When God created a man, He created a man in a certain natural way. When He created a woman, He created a woman in a certain natural way. And then when God brought them together, He expected them to interact and relate to one another in a natural way. And what is that natural way? Heterosexual procreation with children as the result in a context of a relationship called a marriage. That's the natural way that God created. So it's the nature's created order. Now, some of the gay activists say, well, nature can't be used because there are instances of homosexuality in the animal kingdom. Well, it doesn't make any difference if there are instances in the animal kingdom. Say the animal kingdom is a mirror image of the human kingdom as far as the percentage of homosexual activity. Say, in the animal kingdom, 1 to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% of all sexuality takes place as homosexual. Well, that doesn't prove anything other than there are deviant, aberrant behaviors in all kinds of creatures on this earth. Animal kingdom and human kingdom. They're aberrant behavior. It doesn't mean that that's the way it should be or that that is permitted, because God created a man and a woman, and He created them in a context for marriage and with children in mind, and you cannot have children in mind in a homosexual relationship because it can't happen, because it's impossible biologically. And so we see here, it says in verse 27, in the same way, men also abandoned natural relationships with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. They were inflamed with lust. That is a homosexual desire. When you're inflamed with lust for another man, that is a homosexual desire. That is not a heterosexual response. And so this is why you cannot say that this is a heterosexual man relationship, only they're doing something unnatural, which is they're trying to do a homosexual activity. No, this is two men who have relationships with one another and they're inflamed in lust with one another. That's homosexuality. That's a sin. The Bible says that's sin from cover to cover, from Old Testament to the New Testament. And so Romans, we see, cannot be used in any shape or form to justify what we're seeing today, this gay marriage, same-sex marriage movement. It says, finally, in the last part, men committed indecent acts with each other. The Bible calls homosexual activity, lesbianism and male activity, indecent. Indecent. And so it should be discouraged, it should be prohibited, and we need to pray that people will come back to their senses in our country. Well, we'll see you next time for another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.